Hello, welcome, bienvenidos. If you're watching this video, you are either about to start studying the present tense in Spanish, you are in the middle of studying the present tense in Spanish, or maybe you finished studying the present tense in Spanish. In any case, I created this video to help give you a bird's eye view of the present tense in Spanish. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of review of the basics here. The basis of the Spanish verb system is the infinitive. It's really important to know what the infinitive is so that you can begin conjugating verbs in Spanish. So what is the infinitive, you ask? Well, the infinitive is the unconjugated verb. This simply means that you haven't assigned it a subject yet, and you haven't decided to use it in the past, present, or future yet. You haven't given it a time. The word tense really means time here, so you haven't given it a verb tense. So when you conjugate a verb, well, you pick a subject and you decide, am I going to use this verb in the past, present, or future? And then you just use it because you've learned it, you've studied it, you've memorized it, you practice with it. So when we start talking or conversing, we basically choose from three major options. We're going to talk about the past, we're going to talk about the present, or the future. Well, the topic of this video is the present tense. So if you're the typical college student taking a course in Spanish, whether you realize it or not, your textbook teaches you the present tense in many pieces. In other words, the lessons are spread out usually through 2 or 3 different chapters, so you get little bits and pieces of it. So the purpose of this video is I want to show you all the pieces, give you a nice bird's eye view of the verb tense so that you can understand it a little bit better. So these are the different components of the Spanish verb tense. So if you start flipping through any college textbook, normally these topics that have to do with the present tense are presented in more or less this order that you see here. We always start with the verb ser. That's the first verb that you learn, and you're given the conjugation in the present tense. You learn about subject pronouns, and basically ser is an irregular verb, so you just have to learn the forms. The next topic is usually regular AR verbs. Textbooks always start with regular AR verbs because most verbs in Spanish, most infinitives end in AR. So when you learn about how to conjugate regular AR verbs, you're learning how to conjugate the majority of verbs in Spanish. Then you go on to regular ER verbs, then regular IR verbs. Then you're told that not all verbs are regular. They don't all follow the same pattern. So you have verbs with spelling changes. There's usually a lesson on that, or it might be integrated into one of these 3. Then you learn about stem changing verbs. Basically, as the name implies, the stem changes when you conjugate them. Then there are verbs that we call irregular yo verbs, where only the yo form is irregular and all of the other forms are quote-unquote regular. Then you just learn the plain and simple irregular verbs. So you basically have to memorize the forms. Just like you did the verb ser, you have to memorize the forms for tener, venir, ver, oír, and other verbs that are classified as irregular. Then there's usually a lesson on the verb gustar. Gustar is an interesting verb because structurally it doesn't function like all of these other verbs. So there's a lesson on that. Then there's what we call reflexive verbs, which there aren't very many of them, but the ones that do exist are used very much in conversation, so you absolutely need to learn reflexive verbs. Then there's a classification of verbs called reciprocal verbs, and finally modal verbs. So these are all the pieces of the present tense. So if you're studying the present tense, I do have an individual video lesson for each one of these topics, so you can go back to my channel homepage and find them. I also have a playlist with just these topics in one place. So if you're studying the present tense or reviewing the entire present tense, you'll see all of these videos together. And that's basically it as far as the pieces that you get. There's only one other thing that I think is important to mention, when you conjugate a verb in any verb tense, any of the verb tenses that you're learning, my suggestion is that you always be sure that you know two things. The first thing is you have to know how to conjugate it. I call this the mechanics of it, how to physically manipulate it to get the right forms. For example, with a regular AR verb, you learn that you take off the AR and you're left with the root. So this is the root of trabajar, which means to work. And then you just add the ending. So for example, yo, it would be trabajo. The ending is o. If the subject is tú, then the ending is as. So we would have tú trabajas, and so forth and so on. So that is what I call the mechanics of it. The second part is it's good to know when you have a conjugated verb, it's good to know what meanings that you get from that verb tense in your first language. So if your first language is English, let me give you an example here. If I conjugate this verb trabajar in the present tense with yo as my subject, I get yo trabajo. And you have to understand that yo trabajo can mean three different things in the present tense. It can mean I work, if you're talking about your daily routine. It can also mean I do work. We call this the emphatic do. And in English, this usually comes after a negative question. For example, if I say something like, you don't work, do you? And if your answer is to the contrary, you say, no, I do work. You're using the do for emphasis, so we call this the emphatic do. And by the way, we ask all of our questions with the emphatic do. For example, do you work? Do you know the answer? Do you eat pizza? We always begin with an emphatic do. Okay, so this one thing here, this one form in Spanish can mean I work, I do work, or it can also mean I am working. If somebody asks me the question in Spanish, ¿Qué haces? What are you doing? ¿Qué haces ahora? What are you doing right now? I can answer by saying, pues trabajo. And that means I am working because of the context of the situation, the context of the conversation. So for the present tense, one conjugated form can actually mean three things. Well, there's actually another. You get a bonus in Spanish. A verb conjugated in the present tense, if it's used with a word or phrase that refers to the future, then you can also have a future meaning from just the present tense. In other words, yo trabajo can mean I am going to work if I'm using the word mañana, meaning tomorrow. I'm going to work tomorrow, or I will work tomorrow. So the present tense in Spanish is very powerful. You can get four meanings from one conjugated verb. Not all verb tenses work like this, but the present tense does have multiple meanings. So whenever you study a verb tense in Spanish, be sure you know the mechanics, number one. And number two, when that verb is conjugated, be sure you know what meanings it's giving you. Well, all that's left to say is just have fun using the present tense in Spanish. You can really do a lot with it. Es todo. Hasta luego.